On June 14th, 1883, at Darlington Station in Yorkshire, a railway photographer named James Whitworth captured an image that would challenge every rational explanation for the next century and beyond. The photograph, now preserved in the archives of the Yorkshire Railway Museum, under catalogue number NER 183-147, shows what appears to be a simple portrait of Victorian newlyweds in their first-class train compartment. But what it actually documents is something far more disturbing, something that should not exist. In the image, seated side by side in the plush velvet seats of compartment number 7, are Dr. Thomas Blackwood and his bride of 15 days, Margaret Blackwood, formerly Margaret Hartley of Leeds. They are dressed in their traveling clothes, Thomas in a dark wool suit with his watch chain visible across his waistcoat, Margaret in a high-collared traveling dress with her hair pinned in the fashion of the day. Both are looking directly at the camera, with the slightly stiff expressions common to early photography, when subjects had to remain absolutely motionless for the 10-second exposure time required by the wet collodion process. But standing directly behind them, clearly visible in the same sharp focus as the couple themselves, is a third figure. This figure, tall and dressed in formal Victorian attire that appears somehow dated even for 1883, stands with its hands positioned near the shoulders of the seated couple, close enough that it should be touching them. The face, while distinct enough to confirm it is indeed a human form, possesses a quality that makes it difficult to examine for long, a certain indistinctness that exists despite the photograph's otherwise remarkable clarity. What makes this image particularly significant, what elevates it from mere curiosity to genuine impossibility, lies in the documented facts surrounding its creation. Station Master Harold Pemberton's meticulously kept logbook, also preserved in the museum archives, confirms that only 2 passengers boarded the first-class carriage at Leeds that morning: Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Compartment 7, tickets numbered 3047 and 348. The conductor's report, filed as part of the railway's standard operational records, confirms that he personally checked Compartment 7 twice during the journey from Leeds to Darlington, and on both occasions observed only the newlywed couple. The compartment door had been locked from the inside, as was common practice for first-class passengers seeking privacy. James Whitworth himself, a photographer of 30 years' experience, who had documented hundreds of railway passengers for the Northeastern Railway Company's promotional materials, swore in a written statement dated June 15, 1883, that when he approached the compartment, knocked, received permission to enter, and set up his camera equipment, only Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood were present. He was certain of this fact. He staked his professional reputation on it. Yet when he developed the glass plate negative in the station's darkroom facility, less than 20 minutes after the exposure was made, 3 people stared back at him from the image. What happened on that June day would set in motion an investigation that would consume the Blackwoods' lives, challenge the rational foundations of Victorian scientific thought, and leave a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. But before we dive into this nightmare, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. To understand the full significance of what occurred on that train journey, one must first understand exactly who Thomas and Margaret Blackwood were, because their credibility would become central to everything that followed. Dr. Thomas Blackwood, age 34 at the time of the photograph, was a physician of considerable reputation in Leeds, having studied medicine at Edinburgh University before returning to his native Yorkshire to establish a practice focused on diseases of the nervous system. His published papers in the Medical Journal of Yorkshire had earned him recognition among his peers for his methodical approach to diagnosis and his insistence on empirical evidence over speculation. He was, by every account, the embodiment of Victorian rationalism, a man who believed that every phenomenon had an explanation rooted in natural law, a man utterly unsuited by temperament and training to become the central figure in an inexplicable mystery. Margaret Hartley, 26 years old, and the eldest daughter of mill owner Edmund Hartley, was similarly grounded in the practical realities of industrial Yorkshire. Educated at Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies in Harrogate, she had assisted her father with the administrative aspects of his textile business, demonstrating a capacity for figures and logical thinking that was unusual for women of her social class in that era. Their courtship had been proper, sensible, and thoroughly documented in the social columns of the Leeds Mercury. They had met at a charity function for the Leeds General Infirmary in September of 1881, been formally introduced by mutual acquaintances, and conducted their relationship with the careful propriety expected of respectable Victorian society. Thomas had called upon Margaret at the Hartley residence every Thursday evening for over a year before proposing in December of 1882. Their wedding at St. Peter's Church in Leeds on May 30th, 1883, was attended by over 200 guests, including prominent physicians, industrialists, and members of Leeds society. The ceremony was recorded in both the church register and the society pages, a thoroughly witnessed and documented union between two eminently rational, credible individuals. Their planned honeymoon reflected this same practical sensibility. A journey by rail from Leeds to Edinburgh, where Thomas had studied and maintained professional connections, followed by a week exploring the Scottish capital before returning to establish their household in Leeds. They had booked first-class passage on the Northeastern Railway's morning service, departing Leeds at 10:15 on June 14th, traveling through York and Darlington to Newcastle, then continuing to Edinburgh. The route was well established, comfortable, and entirely unremarkable. On the morning of their departure, Edmund Hartley personally accompanied the couple to Leeds Station, as did Thomas's colleague, Dr. James Morrison, and his wife. All four witnesses later provided statements confirming that Thomas and Margaret boarded the train alone. that they watched the couple enter Compartment 7, that the door was closed behind them, and that no other person approached or entered the compartment before the train departed. These were not credulous country folk, prone to superstition, but educated members of Victorian society's professional class, and their testimony was precise and unwavering. What makes the photograph so profoundly disturbing is that it contradicts the testimony of credible witnesses and the documented thoughts surrounding two of the most rational, level-headed individuals in Leeds. The 10:15 morning service from Leeds to Edinburgh was one of the Northeastern Railway's flagship routes, a journey that represented the pinnacle of Victorian railway engineering and comfort. The train itself consisted of 12 carriages, including 3 first-class carriages positioned immediately behind the locomotive and coal tender, designed to provide the smoothest possible ride for passengers willing to pay the premium fare. Compartment 7, which Thomas had booked 3 weeks in advance at a cost of £2.06 for the full journey to Edinburgh, was located in the second first-class carriage, on the right side of the train facing the direction of travel. Victorian first-class compartments were designed as private sanctuaries, each measuring approximately 8 feet by 6 feet. Fitted with padded velvet seats that could accommodate 6 passengers, though, were frequently booked by couples seeking privacy. The compartment featured a door that locked from the inside with a substantial brass mechanism, windows with drawn curtains that could be adjusted for privacy, and polished wood paneling that spoke to the railway company's commitment to luxury. Station Master Harold Pemberton's records, maintained with the obsessive precision that characterized railway operations in that era, documented every detail of the departure. The train left Leeds exactly on schedule. All tickets had been collected and verified. All passengers were accounted for in their designated compartments. Adjacent to Compartment 7, in Compartment 6, traveled Mr. and Mrs. Albert Sedgwick of York, who later provided statements to railway officials confirming they heard nothing unusual from the neighboring compartment during the journey. In Compartment 8, a Mr. Jonathan Hargreaves, a wool merchant traveling alone to Newcastle, similarly reported hearing nothing that suggested the presence of anyone beyond the expected 2 passengers. The journey's first segment, from Leeds to York, a distance of some 24 miles requiring approximately 40 minutes, passed without incident. The weather that June morning was overcast but dry, typical for Yorkshire in early summer, with low clouds that occasionally revealed glimpses of pale sunlight. The countryside rolled past the windows in shades of green, the industrial landscape of Leeds giving way to the agricultural lands of the Vale of York. At York Station, during the scheduled 15-minute stop to take on additional passengers and water, Margaret descended briefly to the platform to stretch her legs, and it was during this interlude that she made an entry in her traveling journal, a small leather-bound book that she later surrendered to investigators and which now resides in the Yorkshire Railway Museum archives alongside the photograph. Her entry, dated June 14th, 1883, 11:30 in the morning, reads in part, "The journey thus far has been comfortable, though I confess to a peculiar sensation of being observed, which I attribute to the natural self-consciousness of being newly married and traveling in such close quarters. Thomas assures me it is merely nerves, and I am certain he is right, though the feeling persists even when I know we are quite alone. The precision of this entry, written hours before the photograph was taken, would later become crucial evidence that something was already present, already watching, before it was captured on film." The train departed York at 11:45, continuing north toward Darlington, and it was during this segment of the journey that the impossible would be documented forever. James Whitworth was 53 years old in the summer of 1883, a professional photographer who had been contracted by the Northeastern Railway Company since 1878 to document their services as part of an ambitious promotional campaign designed to showcase the comfort and modernity of first-class rail travel. His assignment was straightforward. At major stations along the route, he would approach first-class passengers and offer to photograph them in their compartments, capturing images that would later be used in the railway's advertising materials and also offered to the passengers themselves as complimentary souvenirs of their journey. Whitworth was a meticulous craftsman who had learned his trade in the early days of wet collodion photography, and his technical precision was beyond reproach. When the Leeds to Edinburgh service arrived at Darlington Station at precisely 1:27 that afternoon, Whitworth was waiting on the platform with his camera equipment, as he had done hundreds of times before. He approached the first-class carriages, moving from compartment to compartment, and when he reached Compartment 7, he knocked politely on the door and received permission to enter from Dr. Blackwood. What happened next was documented in Whitworth's sworn statement, signed before a magistrate on June 15th, 1883, and his account never wavered in the decades that followed. When Thomas unlocked the door from inside and opened it, Whitworth observed exactly 2 people in the compartment, Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood, seated side by side on the plush seats, appearing exactly as one would expect a honeymoon couple to appear. The compartment was well lit by the afternoon sun filtering through the windows, and Whitworth could see clearly that no other person was present. He introduced himself, explained the railway's photography program, and received the couple's consent to be photographed. Thomas and Margaret remained seated while Whitworth set up his camera equipment, a process that required approximately 5 minutes as he positioned the tripod, mounted the camera, inserted the prepared glass plate negative, and arranged the composition to capture both the couple and enough of the compartment's interior to showcase the luxury of first-class travel. The technical requirements of wet collodion photography in 1883 demanded that subjects remain absolutely still for the duration of the exposure, which Whitworth calculated would require 10 seconds given the available light. He instructed the Blackwoods to hold their position, to avoid any movement that might blur the image, and then he removed the lens cap, counted silently to 10, and replaced the cap. The exposure was complete. Whitworth thanked the couple, informed them that he would develop the plate immediately in the darkroom facility that the railway maintained at Darlington Station for exactly this purpose, and that he would return with the finished photograph within 30 minutes. He gathered his equipment, exited the compartment, and watched as Thomas locked the door once again from the inside. In the dark room, Whitworth followed the development process he had performed thousands of times. The glass plate was immersed in the developing solution, the image gradually appearing as the chemicals worked their transformation. What emerged from that chemical bath was an image that Whitworth would later describe as the most disturbing thing he had encountered in 30 years of professional photography. When he returned to Compartment 7 and presented the finished photograph to the Blackwoods, their reaction moved through several distinct phases. First, confusion as they tried to understand what they were seeing. Then a careful examination of the image as if it might be some trick of light or shadow. And finally, a dawning alarm as they realized that the figure standing behind them in the photograph was impossibly, undeniably present in an image taken of a locked compartment that contained only 2 people. The figure in the photograph stands directly behind the seated couple, positioned in the narrow space between the back of their seat and the compartment's rear wall, a space that measured, according to railway specifications, no more than 18 inches in width. The figure is tall, considerably taller than average for the period, and appears to be male, based on the clothing and general build, though there exists a peculiar quality to the image that makes definitive identification difficult, despite the photograph's otherwise remarkable clarity. The face, while clearly visible and possessing distinct human features, including eyes, nose, and mouth, seems to resist detailed examination, as if some quality of the photographic emulsion refused to capture it with the same precision applied to everything else in the frame. The clothing is formal Victorian dress, a dark coat and waistcoat with what appears to be a high collar, but the style carries an anachronistic quality that several fashion historians who later examined the photograph noted with confusion, suggesting the garments were cut in a manner fashionable, perhaps 20 or 30 years before 1883, yet appearing somehow newer than that dating would suggest. The hands of the figure are positioned near the shoulders of Thomas and Margaret, close enough that contact seems inevitable, yet both would later insist with absolute certainty that they felt no physical touch during the exposure. What makes the figure's position particularly impossible is the spatial geometry of the compartment itself. For a person to stand where this figure appears to stand would require either that they materialize within the wall itself, or that they possess a physical form so compressed as to defy human anatomy. The compartment's rear wall was solid wood paneling backed by the exterior shell of the railway carriage, with no space for anyone to stand, no hidden alcove or architectural feature that could explain the presence. The technical aspects of the photograph only deepen the impossibility. The figure is in perfect focus, exhibiting the same photographic sharpness as Thomas and Margaret themselves, which eliminates the possibility of movement during the 10-second exposure that might have created a ghostly blur. The tonal values are consistent with the lighting conditions in the compartment, showing proper shadow and highlight that indicate the figure was present in the physical space during the exposure, not added through double exposure or other darkroom manipulation. Whitworth examined the glass plate negative with a magnifying lens, searching desperately for some explanation, some flaw in the emulsion or crack in the glass that might account for what he was seeing, and found nothing. The image was photographically sound, technically perfect, and absolutely impossible. Margaret's reaction, recorded in multiple accounts, including Thomas's own written statement, was immediate recognition. "I felt someone there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The whole journey, I felt observed. And here is the proof that I was not imagining it." Thomas, whose entire professional life had been built on empirical observation and rational explanation, found himself confronting evidence that contradicted everything he believed about the nature of reality. He examined the photograph with the same methodical attention he would apply to a medical diagnosis, looking for any detail that might provide a natural explanation, and found none. Whitworth, whose 30 years of photographic experience encompassed every type of technical error, deliberate trick, and optical phenomenon known to the medium, could offer no professional explanation beyond the one that his rational mind refused to accept. The camera had captured something that was present in that compartment, something that human eyes could not see, but photographic emulsion could record. He made the decision, there on the platform at Darlington Station, to retain both the glass plate negative and several prints made from it, sensing that what he held represented something of profound significance, though he could not yet understand what. Station Master Harold Pemberton was summoned to the platform within minutes of the photograph's presentation to the Blackwoods, and what began as a routine inquiry into a passenger complaint quickly evolved into something far more perplexing. Pemberton, a railway official of 22 years' experience who prided himself on maintaining comprehensive documentation of every aspect of station operations, retrieved his logbooks and began a methodical review of all records pertaining to the 10:15 service from Leeds. The ticket records showed exactly what they should show: 2 first-class tickets purchased by Dr. Thomas Blackwood for Compartment 7, tickets numbered 3,847 and 3,848. No other tickets issued for that compartment, no additional passengers recorded. The boarding logs maintained by platform staff at Leeds Station confirmed that only Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood had entered Compartment 7, that the door had been closed and locked from inside immediately after boarding, and that no other person had approached the compartment before the train's departure. The conductor responsible for the first-class carriages, a Mr. William Jessup who had served the Northeastern Railway for 15 years, provided testimony that was both detailed and deeply unsettling. Jessup stated that he had personally checked Compartment 7 twice during the journey from Leeds to Darlington, once shortly after departure from Leeds, and again after leaving York, and on both occasions he had knocked, been granted entry, observed only Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood seated in the compartment, exchanged pleasantries, and withdrawn. He was absolutely certain that no third person was present during either inspection, and he noted specifically that the compartment door had been locked from inside on both occasions, which was standard practice for first-class passengers, but which also meant that no one could have entered without the Blackwoods' knowledge and cooperation. The passengers in adjacent compartments, Mayor and Mrs. Sedgwick in Compartment 6 and Mr. Hargreaves in Compartment 8, both provided statements confirming they had observed no one approaching or entering Compartment 7, had heard no sounds suggesting the presence of anyone beyond 2 people, and had noticed nothing unusual about the journey until the commotion on the platform at Darlington. Thomas, drawing upon his medical training and his instinct to document clinical observations, began immediately to create a written account of everything that had occurred, a document that now resides in the archives of the Yorkshire Medical Society under the title An Account of Unexplained Phenomena Observed During Railway Travel, June 1883. His training compelled him to record details with scientific precision: times, locations, witnesses, physical sensations, rational possibilities considered and eliminated. Margaret's condition, however, was deteriorating rapidly. The sensation of being observed, which she had attributed to nerves and new marriage self-consciousness, had intensified into something approaching panic, now that photographic evidence confirmed her intuition had been correct. She reported to Thomas that the feeling had not diminished with the photograph's revelation, but rather had grown stronger, as if whatever presence had been captured on film was now somehow more aware of being detected. The question of whether to continue the journey or return immediately to Leeds was debated on the platform at Darlington, with Station Master Pemberton offering to arrange return passage at the railway's expense. Thomas and Margaret, however, refused what they perceived as a surrender to hysteria, a very Victorian determination to proceed with their planned honeymoon, despite the inexplicable circumstances. They would continue to Edinburgh, they insisted, and they would not allow fear of the unknown to dictate their actions. The railway company's concern, meanwhile, extended beyond the welfare of 2 passengers to encompass the potential damage to their reputation, and particularly to the photography program that had, ironically, documented the very impossibility they would prefer to deny. What Thomas and Margaret could not have known as they made the decision to continue their journey was that their experience was not unprecedented, merely the first to be documented with photographic evidence that could not be dismissed or suppressed. Research into the railway's operational history, conducted initially by Thomas himself in the months following the incident, and expanded considerably by railway historian Edmund Fairfax in the 1920s, revealed a pattern of incidents on the Leeds to Edinburgh route that the North Eastern Railway Company had systematically minimized or ignored. The company's archives, which Fairfax was granted access to following the retirement of several key officials who had overseen the earlier suppressions, contained reports dating back to 1870, just 3 years after the route had been established in its modern configuration. In October of 1870, no fewer than 4 separate first-class passengers filed formal complaints describing sensations of being watched, of sharing their supposedly private compartments with presences they could not see but could distinctly feel. The railway's response had been to attribute these complaints to the psychological effects of railway travel, a common diagnosis in an era when medical authorities still debated whether the human constitution could withstand speeds in excess of 30 miles per hour. In August of 1876, a conductor named Robert Pelham submitted a written report describing an incident in which he claimed to have observed a figure standing in Compartment 7 during a routine inspection, a figure that vanished completely in the moment between his first glimpse and his second look. Pelham's report was dismissed as the result of fatigue or possibly intoxication, and he was reassigned to goods trains shortly thereafter. Most significantly, in June of 1879, exactly 4 years before the Blackwood photograph, a railway photographer whose name was redacted from the official records produced an image that reportedly showed similar anomalies during a journey on the same route. This photograph, according to railway correspondence discovered by Fairfax, was deemed too potentially damaging to the company's reputation and was either destroyed or so thoroughly suppressed that no trace of it has ever been recovered. The specific compartment, number 7 in the second first-class carriage, appeared with disturbing frequency in these reports, accounting for nearly 70% of all incidents documented on the route. Fairfax's research extended beyond the railway's operational records to examine the history of the land itself, and what he discovered provided historical context, if not rational explanation. The route between York and Darlington followed, in several stretches, the path of ancient coaching roads that themselves had been established along Roman routes, and local folklore associated these roads with phenomena that predated the railway by centuries. Coach travelers in the 18th century had reported similar experiences, documented in letters and diaries that Fairfax uncovered in county archives, describing the sensation of invisible passengers and glimpses of figures that should not exist. The area around Darlington in particular held significance in regional folklore as a crossing point, though the precise nature of what was being crossed remained vague in the oral traditions Fairfax collected. The land that the railway occupied near Darlington Station had been in medieval times the site of a crossroads where, according to records from the Durham Cathedral archives, travelers had reported encounters with what were termed wayfarers between worlds as early as the 13th century. Before that crossroads, the Romans had maintained a way station on the same spot, and archaeological excavations in 1892 uncovered evidence of ritual activity suggesting the site held spiritual significance even in pre-Roman times. What became clear through this research was that the railway had not created whatever phenomenon the Blackwoods experienced. but had merely provided a modern conveyance through a landscape that had been associated with impossible occurrences for more than 1,000 years. The Blackwoods arrived in Edinburgh on the evening of June 14th, completing their journey despite the afternoon's disturbing events. But the honeymoon that was meant to be a celebration of their new life together had been irreversibly transformed into something closer to an ordeal. Margaret's condition deteriorated significantly during their 3 days in the Scottish capital, her nights plagued by nightmares in which she felt the presence from the train standing at the foot of their hotel bed, watching them with an attention that felt both ancient and hungry. She would wake, gasping, certain that someone had been touching her face, though Thomas, sleeping beside her, never observed any disturbance beyond Margaret's own movements. During their waking hours, the persistent sensation of being observed followed her through Edinburgh's streets, into its shops and attractions, a feeling so oppressive that she found herself constantly turning to look behind her, expecting to see the figure from the photograph standing among the crowds. Thomas continued his documentation with clinical precision, recording Margaret's symptoms in a separate section of his account. Elevated pulse rate, difficulty sleeping, persistent anxiety, hypervigilance, loss of appetite, all psychological manifestations with no apparent physical cause. On June 17th, their 4th day in Edinburgh, and barely halfway through their planned honeymoon, they made the decision to return to Leeds. The journey south was undertaken in a private carriage hired at considerable expense, as Margaret refused absolutely to board another train, her distress at the suggestion so profound that Thomas did not press the matter. Back in Leeds, Margaret's symptoms persisted, despite the familiar surroundings of their new household. Thomas consulted with his medical colleagues, presenting both his detailed observations and the photograph itself as evidence that his wife's condition might stem from genuine phenomenon rather than nervous disorder. The response from the Victorian medical establishment was predictable and deeply frustrating. Margaret was diagnosed with acute hysteria, brought on by the stresses of marriage and travel. Her symptoms attributed to the particular susceptibility of the female nervous system to suggestion and emotional overwhelm. The photograph was dismissed as either a technical error that Whitworth was too embarrassed to admit, or possibly a deliberate hoax, though what purpose such a hoax might serve was never adequately explained. Several colleagues suggested with barely concealed condescension that Thomas's judgment had been compromised by his emotional attachment to his wife, that he was allowing affection to override his scientific training. The photograph did circulate among certain circles, however, finding its way to the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society, where it generated considerable debate. The society's more progressive members, influenced by the emerging spiritualist movement and by recent scientific discussions about phenomena that existed beyond human perception, argued that the photograph represented potential evidence of realities that conventional science had not yet developed tools to measure. The more conservative members maintained that accepting such evidence would undermine the entire foundation of rational inquiry, that there must be a natural explanation, even if it had not yet been identified. Margaret's recovery, to the extent that recovery occurred, took place gradually over the following months. The nightmares diminished in frequency and intensity. The sensation of being constantly observed faded to an occasional unease. Her appetite and sleep patterns normalized. By the end of 1883, to any external observer, she appeared to have returned to her previous state of health. One symptom, however, never resolved: her absolute refusal to travel by train under any circumstances, a prohibition that remained in force for the rest of her life. In a letter to her younger sister, Elizabeth, dated March 1885 and preserved in family archives, Margaret wrote with unusual candor about the experience. "I have never spoken of this to anyone beyond Thomas, and now you, but I remain convinced that what appeared in that photograph was present throughout our journey, that it had perhaps been waiting in that compartment for some time before we boarded, and that it wanted something from us. Though what that something might be, I cannot fathom and do not wish to discover." The photograph's journey through the decades that followed became almost as remarkable as the image itself, passing through the hands of investigators, skeptics, and researchers who approached it with technologies and methodologies that James Whitworth could never have imagined. Whitworth himself maintained custody of the glass plate negative and several original prints until 1910, when at age 80 and in failing health, he donated his entire photographic archive to the newly established Yorkshire Railway Museum, with the specific stipulation that the Blackwood photograph be preserved and made available for scientific study. He included with the donation a sealed letter, to be opened only after his death, in which he detailed every aspect of the photograph's creation and swore once more to the impossibility of what he had captured. In the 1920s, as photographic technology advanced and understanding of the medium deepened, experts at the Royal Photographic Society examined the original negative with techniques unavailable in Whitworth's era and concluded that the image showed no evidence of double exposure, no signs of darkroom manipulation, no technical flaws that might account for the anomalous figure. The emulsion was consistent throughout. The tonal values were correct for a single exposure, and the focus of the figure matched the focal plane of the seated couple, confirming that whatever the camera captured existed in the physical space of that compartment. The 1950s brought the attention of early paranormal investigators, who viewed the photograph as potential evidence for survival after death, or for the existence of dimensions beyond normal human perception. Their analyses, while less technically rigorous than the photographic experts, contributed historical context by uncovering many of the earlier incidents on the Leeds to Edinburgh route. The 1970s saw an attempt at digital analysis, among the first application of computer technology to historical photographs. And while the results remained inconclusive regarding what the figure actually was, they definitively confirmed the image's authenticity as an unmanipulated photograph from 1883. The discovery of Margaret's later writings added profound depth to the story. Among papers donated to the Yorkshire Historical Society by her granddaughter in 1967 were diary entries from the 1890s, in which Margaret described a continuing sense that the presence from the train had never entirely left her, that it remained somewhere at the periphery of her awareness, patient and watchful. She wrote in an entry from 1894, "11 years have passed since that journey, and still I sometimes wake with the certainty that it is near, that whatever we encountered in Compartment 7 formed a connection that was never severed." Thomas's final contribution to the mystery came in 1901, when he published a paper in a minor medical journal titled "On Phenomena Beyond Current Medical Understanding," in which he documented the Blackwood photograph alongside several other cases he had encountered of events that defied rational explanation. The paper effectively ended his standing in the medical community, with colleagues viewing his descent into what they considered pseudoscience as a tragic waste of a once promising career. He died in 1919, professionally isolated, but never wavering in his insistence that what the photograph showed was real. The most significant discovery came in 1993, when a comprehensive excavation and cataloging of the Northeastern Railway Company's archives uncovered a cache of suppressed materials, including 5 additional photographs from the 1870s and 1880s, showing similar anomalies. All 5 images were taken on the Leeds to Edinburgh route. All featured Compartment 7, or its equivalent in earlier carriage configurations, and all showed figures that should not have been present. The railway company had systematically collected and hidden these photographs, viewing them as threats to passenger confidence and commercial viability. Pattern analysis of all 6 photographs revealed striking similarities. All were taken within a 5-mile radius of Darlington Station. All occurred during daylight hours between late May and early July, and all showed figures positioned behind or beside passengers who insisted they had been alone. Modern paranormal investigation teams have attempted numerous studies of the location, though the original railway carriages were decommissioned and destroyed in the 1890s, making direct investigation of Compartment 7 impossible. The reports from these contemporary investigations remain inconclusive, though several teams have reported equipment malfunctions and subjective experiences of presence in the area where the original railway line ran. The photograph remains on display at the Yorkshire Railway Museum today, mounted in a climate-controlled case with careful lighting that preserves the delicate glass plate negative, while allowing visitors to examine the image that has puzzled investigators for over a century. Modern viewers consistently report an unsettling quality that persists despite the photograph's age and the distance of years from the event it documents. A sense that the figure standing behind the Blackwoods possesses an awareness that transcends the frozen moment of its capture. That it is somehow looking back at those who look at it. The technical impossibilities that confounded Victorian photographers remain unexplained by contemporary experts, despite advances in photographic science that have revealed the mechanisms behind countless historical anomalies and supposed supernatural images. What the camera captured in Compartment 7 on June 14, 1883, continues to resist categorization, existing in an uncomfortable space between spirit photography, which was largely debunked as fraud or misunderstanding, and something far more disturbing that suggests dimensions of reality operating alongside our own, occasionally intersecting in ways that photographic technology can record, even when human perception cannot. Margaret lived until 1920, reaching the age of 67, and by all accounts led an outwardly conventional life as the wife of a physician, raising 3 children and participating in the social activities expected of her class. But family testimonies, recorded by her granddaughter in the 1960s, describe a woman who carried a profound unease throughout her life, who refused not only to travel by train, but to be photographed under any circumstances after 1883, and who sometimes spoke of feeling watched during moments when she believed herself alone. Her deathbed statement, whispered to her eldest daughter, Catherine, in the final hours of her life, has been preserved in family records. It followed me, you know. All these years it has been waiting, and now perhaps I shall finally understand what it wanted. Thomas preceded her in death by 5 years, dying in 1919 at age 70. Professionally marginalized but intellectually uncompromised, maintaining until his final days that the photograph represented genuine evidence of phenomena that existed beyond current scientific understanding. The railway compartment itself was destroyed when the carriage was decommissioned in 1895. But not before railway workers documented their increasing reluctance to perform maintenance or cleaning on that particular car, reporting sensations of presence and several instances of tools going missing only to reappear in impossible locations. The decision to decommission the entire carriage 12 years before the typical service life of such equipment suggests that the railway company's concern extended beyond the commercial impact of the photograph to encompass the experiences of their own employees. Modern investigations of the Darlington Station area, now extensively rebuilt and bearing little resemblance to its Victorian configuration, continue to generate reports of phenomena that echo the Blackwood's experience. Contemporary travelers, unaware of the photograph's history, have filed complaints describing sensations of being watched in certain areas of the modern station, and several amateur photographers have captured digital images showing anomalies that they cannot explain, though none have achieved the clarity or documentary power of Whitworth's original. The photograph's enduring mystery centers on a fundamental question about the nature of perception and reality. What did the photographic technology of 1883 capture that human eyes present in the same space, at the same moment, could not see? The implications extend far beyond a single Victorian honeymoon couple, suggesting that we exist surrounded by layers of reality that remain invisible to biological perception, but which technology, in its mechanical objectivity, can sometimes document. The Victorian spiritualist movement would have interpreted the photograph as evidence of life after death, of spirits existing in a realm adjacent to our own. Modern paranormal understanding tends toward theories of dimensional overlap, of moments when the barriers between parallel realities become permeable, allowing something from one side to be captured by instruments on the other. But these remain theories, frameworks we construct to contain mysteries that resist containment. The fundamental question persists, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Who or what was the third passenger in Compartment 7? The photograph offers no response, only the continued presence of that figure, standing behind Thomas and Margaret Blackwood, its hands positioned near their shoulders, its face turned toward the camera with an expression that remains maddeningly unclear despite over a century of examination. The image persists in our collective consciousness, not because it provides answers, but because it documents with irrefutable clarity that there are questions we have not yet learned how to properly ask, let alone answer. In an age that has developed technologies allowing us to photograph distant galaxies and particles smaller than atoms, we remain unable to explain what James Whitworth's camera captured on that June afternoon in 1883, and that failure of explanation stands as testimony to the limits of rational understanding and the possibility that reality extends far beyond what our evolved senses allow us to perceive.